All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me here today. So my name's Adele Carpenter, and I'm a software engineer at Trifork, Amsterdam. Most of my day I spend building and maintaining Java and Kotlin applications for the educational sector. And I would really just like to start off by thanking you all for choosing to attend this session. I do actually have some really stiff competition for this slot with Kevin Henny speaking in another room at this moment. So I really do thank you for that, and I hope that you are not disappointed. And actually, what I really mean by that is that you won't be disappointed. And I mean, Kevin who? So quickly, I'm just going to go through the format of today's talk. It's probably a little bit different to the other talks that you did see today. So I'm going to be exploring two case studies in a storytelling format. Then we'll pull out some lessons that we can apply to software development. So there's a little bit of drama and you do need a little bit of imagination. So are you ready? Yes, good. I was going to ask again. All right, so our first case study begins on September 8th, 1989. It's 4:25 p.m. and Partner Flight 394 from Oslo to Hamburg has just hit its cruising altitude north of the coast of Denmark. The first officer on this flight is Finn Peter Berg, who's only 4 months away from retirement. He's been flying most of his adult life, and even though he still loves flying, he is really looking forward to retirement. He's really just getting tired of all the ancillary crap associated with being both a pilot and a flight operations manager for a struggling charter flight company. He wants less stress and more time with his grandkids. What kind of stress is he under? Well, 45 minutes earlier, he was arguing with the in-flight caterer about overdue catering bills. The situation was so bad that the flight would actually not be cleared to depart unless the bill for this flight was settled. So Berg does the only thing that he can do, which is pull out his wallet and pay the bill with his own money. Now that is annoying in and of itself, but this incident came after he'd already spent some time with his flight mechanic trying to resolve an issue. The left AC power generator was not working, and without two working generators, they would not be cleared for takeoff. So eventually they decide to use a backup generator, and these issues caused the flight to be delayed by an hour. But by now, this is all dealt with. So Berg is now relaxing into the cruise. He looks over to the captain, his good friend of 30 years. The captain looks back at Berg knowingly and they both chuckle and roll their eyes. Thousands of hours of flying experience apiece and still stressing over catering. Even in the 1980s, the golden age of aviation was well and truly over. At this point, Berg notices an aircraft approaching at high speed between two layers of cloud. He points and calls out. He's like, "Look, it's your 11 o'clock. An F-16, the captain replies as a jet zooms overhead. So let's just move now back a couple of meters into the cabin. So here, in contrast to the cockpit, the atmosphere is actually buzzing. Half of the head office staff of the Norwegian shipping company, Wilhelmsen, are on their way to name the latest ship in the fleet, the Topaz. Now, this had limited spaces on this charter flight, so all 50 passengers had to actually win their seats through a competition at work. So everyone is in a great mood as they enjoy the onboard service. And in the back of the cabin, we find 44-year-old Turid Birkeland. She's on the flight as a reward for 26 years of service at Wilhelmsen, and she's actually set to be the ship's godmother. So this is an honor that requires her to write a speech at the naming ceremony. So she's sitting there in the back of the plane and she's scribbling feverishly in her notebook. Her glass of champagne is dancing on the tray table as she writes. But then she stops writing for a moment and she notices that the glass is still dancing. If anything, it's dancing more vigorously. She's never flown in a plane with propellers before, so just assumes that to be part of the experience. Suddenly, the glass flies off the tray table and smashes into the window next to her. The nose of the plane has turned violently to the right as if it were pushed. Turid feels herself being pulled towards the ceiling of the cabin, but thankfully she is held in place by her seatbelt. However, a flight attendant in the middle of serving drinks is not so lucky. She crashes into the ceiling and looks to be badly injured. Panicked, Turid notices something at the corner of her eye. She looks out the window and sees a large piece of metal flash past the wings. Wingless, the plane accelerates rapidly downward, and within seconds it crashes into the sea below. None of the 55 passengers on board survive, leaving behind grieving families and a broken shipping company. So let's fast forward a bit. It's July 1993, and it's 4 years since Partner Flight 394 went down. I can just sort of see in my imagination the lead investigator, Finn Heimdall, sitting down at his IBM PS2 computer at the head office at the Accident Investigation Board in Norway, opening up, Word Perfect to put the finishing touches on his flight investigation report. He stares at the screen, his index fingers hovering above the keyboard, muttering to himself, "Where is the sea?" before finishing and typing his current train of thought. But Finn pauses for a moment. He sits back in his chair and takes a break from trying to find the sea, takes a deep breath, and he, stretches his arms overhead. Sorry. As he exhales and lowers his arms, the true magnitude of the last 4 years just seemed to bear down on him all at once. Because not even Finn, a highly experienced professional who's seen it all, could have predicted the long chain of events that led up to the crash of Flight 394. So he sits there and he's thinking back to the first few days of the air crash. Not a lot is known at that point, actually, except that the plane disappeared from radar after taking a sharp turn to the right. Several bodies are quickly recovered, along with floating aircraft debris some distance away. The larger distance gives a clue that the plane broke up in midair. So already at this point, Finn has two possible theories, and let's follow his process. So he knows about the F-16 that was spotted in the area just before the crash. So could a sonic boom of the jet bring the plane down or cause it to disintegrate in midair? And less than a year ago, actually, Pan Am Flight 103 was shot down over Lockerbie, Scotland. So did an act of terror bring the plane down? Both theories are compelling enough for the media to circulate them widely. Their readers seem to really want answers just as much as the victims' families. So the pressure is really, really on. Finn and his team get to work analysing the debris field on the sea floor. After a few days, they have a detailed map, and sure enough, the tail is quite some distance from the main wreckage. So both theories are still technically possible. But not long after this discovery, and following intense media pressure, the military presents an affidavit from an F-16 pilot. He swears that he was flying at least 1,000 feet away from Flight 394, and therefore any sonic boom could not have impacted the flight. Now, this being Denmark and perhaps a not quite as contentious political environment, it's enough for them and the public there that the military was not involved. So a bomb or a missile strike in the rear of the plane is looking increasingly likely, and emotions are running really, really high at this point. So Finn sends parts of the wreckage for analysis for explosive residue. This is actually a very logical next step given the evidence that he has so far. His hands, tremble slightly as he opens the envelope. His worst fears appear to be confirmed. There are indeed traces of explosive residue on the aircraft. But before Finn can even really process this information, the media publishes details of the report. They are certain terrorists did this. But Finn, he's still not convinced. Of course, he wants to wrap up the investigation quickly, but he knows that doing his job right means removing any and all doubt associated with his findings. So he digs a little deeper. So the next morning, he gathers his team and he asks, how can we prove ourselves wrong? What details might we be ignoring because they don't match the bomb theory? And what else could cause a mid-air breakup? To answer the first question, someone on the team suggests a more detailed analysis of the blast residue. So what are the exact levels? Is it what you would expect from a bomb on the plane? Could there be other potential sources of the residue? Finn agrees, and he asks 2 of his team members to follow up. And in response to the second question, another team member points out that so far, no terrorists have claimed credit for this attack. If terrorists did do this, they would likely claim credit. And there are just so many things that could cause a mid-air breakup. So the best way to reduce the scope is the black box, which is almost ready for analysis. Indeed, further examination of the blast residue of the wreckage reveals that the quantities present are just simply too small to have been caused from an explosion on board the aircraft. The difference is like orders of magnitude. So the bomb theory is actually looking less and less likely. But that still leaves the question, if not from a bomb, then from what? Eventually, Finn and his team determined that the residue likely came from the seafloor. Historically, many battles have been fought off the coast of Denmark, and the residue was likely from old ammo or weapons that had been drifted down from the surface. Now, I'll admit this is a really, really unsatisfying answer, but it is in fact the most likely explanation. And thanks to the commitment of Finn and his team to finding the root cause of the crash, the family is actually one step closer to getting answers. They might really feel angry about having to wait, and they might scream fake news, but Finn's discipline in questioning himself and his team thoroughly and ruthlessly is, in my opinion, to be admired. Because the temptation to blame terrorists in the face of intense pressure would just be all too real. Now, in software engineering, unlike air crash investigations, we don't often have the priority or luxury of vast resources to find a root cause of an issue. But we still face pressure from external sources, such as managers or customers, to find a solution to a pressing technical issue. And we face the temptation to implement the first solution that fits. And in those moments, we can take a leaf out of Finn's book when we have a compelling theory by questioning ourselves. So, how can I prove myself wrong? What details might I be ignoring because it doesn't fit my idea or solution? And what else could cause this issue or situation? These are also great questions to throw into meetings. For example, if it's not your area of expertise, but you would really like to help your team. And perhaps even more useful if it is your area of expertise. Experience does have a funny way of hiding our blind spots from us. So we're back in Norway now, and Finn and his team have just ruled out 2 potential causes of the crash, and they're super low on leads. But thankfully, the black box is ready for analysis, which obviously is orange and contains not 1, but 2 recording devices, which have highly original names. Does anyone out there know what these 2 names are? Yes, I've got 1 cockpit voice recorder. Yes, excellent. I know you know. So yes, that's correct. Cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder. But unfortunately, the voice recorder is a dead end. There's some pre-flight discussion recorded, including the first officer complaining about paying the catering bill. But as the engines power up, the recording mysteriously stops. So that leaves the flight data recorder. And this isn't really a dead end, it's just really, really, really confusing. So this is an older mechanical recorder in which like a needle moves up and down on a metal tape, as you can see in the image here. You've got the stylus or the needle and a metal tape running through, kind of like a needle and paper of an old school heart monitor or like a seismograph. Anyway, that's not the confusing part because Finn's seen those before because, he's a professional, right? But what is strange is that there is a double line for the altitude reading, both immediately before the crash and intermittently in several flights before. A double line like the one here that you see is actually really unusual. So this is so unusual, in fact, that Finn actually needs to send the data recorded to the manufacturer in the US, who then in turn needs to call an expert out of retirement in order to get their opinion or to get an explanation. And the retired expert says, well, that double line is caused by a severe vibration, a vibration much greater than expected during a normal flight. So, of course, Finn starts looking for potential causes. So Finn takes himself down to the lab where the wreckage is being reconstructed. And as you can see from these photos, it's a painstaking process putting the aircraft back together piece by piece. I honestly do believe that you do need to be a little bit obsessive and a little bit crazy even to do this work, but it's very important work. And Finn knows that the wreckage can tell you a lot, especially when the black box leaves very little to go on. So anyway, he meets with the team and he learns that they are focusing their attention on the tail and the APU. So most aircraft have something that's called an auxiliary power unit, or an APU. It's generally used to provide power while on the ground before the engines are started up. It's usually located at the back of the aircraft and not designed to operate in flight, except in rare situations such as an emergency. It might even be why if you board, especially from the back, an aircraft, it can feel quite warm while you're sitting on the ground. So the reconstruction team have found evidence that the APU was actually in operation during the flight. The backup generator that I told you about earlier, the one that the pilot and the engineer decided to use, actually was not really a backup generator. It was an undocumented feature of the APU. And not only was it running during the flight, one of the struts attaching the APU to the aircraft itself was broken. So in this case, maybe then the maintenance records can provide some clues. So Finn asks his team to focus their attention on the tail while reviewing them. They find that one of the bolts connecting the tail to the fuselage was replaced only weeks before the crash. So Finn checks back in with the reconstruction team. And this is actually where it gets really juicy because what they uncover is actually a scandal that goes all the way to the White House. The flying White House, Air Force One. So President Clinton has just taken office, which is actually kind of fitting given the scandals that did follow him throughout his presidency. But he's actually not directly to blame for this one, though. So now we're at the point we can set the scene for the big reveal. So 1993 Finn, he reaches into the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulls out a dusty bottle of aquavit and a small glass, a tradition of his to celebrate the conclusion of a case and to commemorate the victims. He takes, a small sip, pauses for a silent moment and describes what happened, one index finger at a time. The crash was caused by a loss of control due to the destruction of the tail. The destruction of the tail was caused by a long chain of factors resulting in a resonant vibration. The replacement of one of the bolts connecting the vertical fin to the fuselage 2 weeks before the crash altered the natural frequency of the tail section. Eventually, the frequency of the tail matched that of the running APU connected to a broken strut of poor quality and unknown origin. The resulting vibration grew in amplitude until it shook the tail section so hard the bolts holding the fin to the fuselage sheared off, breaking the plane into 2 pieces. And without the stabilizing effect of the tail, the plane turned sharply and rolled out of the sky. Inspection of the sheared bolts showed that 3 of the 4 were not of the specified hardness and tensile strength. And further investigation showed that these bullets were counterfeit. After the publication of Finn's report in Norway, the US Aviation Authority, the FAA, they conducted their own investigation into the counterfeit air parts market. This was a mammoth investigation, and it found that the problem of counterfeit parts was so rampant that such parts were found on Air Force One, supposedly the most scrutinized aircrafts in the world. And not only were the parts counterfeit, there was also a market for counterfeit FAA quality assurance tags where suppliers of counterfeit parts would actually sign the name of known aircraft part inspectors. So as an operator, you could buy counterfeit parts and not even realize. Maybe a clue might be the price. And now it's tempting to scoff and say they should have known. But if you were in the precarious financial position of partner, you know, where your pilots are paying the catering bills out of their own pocket, it would be all too tempting to just pay the lower cost, take a quick look and go, yeah, it's got the certification tag, and not ask too many questions. You know, it's got the tag, you've done your job. Now, there is a lot to unpack in this case, and I do find it incredibly fascinating from an engineering point of view. The long chain of seemingly unlikely events that ultimately cost 55 people their lives. Incremental choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but deadly in combination. So here again is the map of all the events that contributed to Partner Flight 394. You don't need to study it right now. I will be sharing my slides after the talk. It's more to just give an impression of the scale of the events and their relationships. And you can see that the first decision that contributed to this disaster was 10 years before the crash. So like a form of technical debt, if you allow the analogy. And if we follow the sequence of events until the end, we get 3 counterfeit bolts. So in my role as a software engineer, I work with open source software under JVM. So you could argue that by strict definition, counterfeit isn't really possible. The original source code is available for download, so there's no need to make an illegal copy of it. But what about code snippets that we just copy and paste into our code base? Again, we scoff and say that everyone knows that Stack Overflow is just a suggestion and we shouldn't blindly copy paste from it. But what about other sources of code snippets? Documentation, blogs, Git, community forums, conference slides. I have certainly blindly copied code into my project, especially as a nervous junior working with yet another new technology, just making myself feel better in the knowledge that I have code reviews and I got testing to back me up. The truth, though, is that I'm actually responsible for every line of code that I write, and this includes code that I've copied and pasted. It's my duty to understand every line of it, pull it apart, and dissect it. You know, check what it's importing and why. And the reason I care about code quality is not because I want to get a pat on the head for being a perfect developer. The reason is that real people use the software that I contribute to, teachers and school kids, in fact. So what can we learn from Finn and his team to help us improve the quality of the software that we contribute to? So we can start by seeing outcomes as the result of a chain of events that we can learn from if we examine them. We can take our time to investigate all options. Often the time constraints we put on ourselves are fairly arbitrary. Sometimes they're not, but a lot of the times they are. It could even be as simple as going to lunch before pushing your latest changes. You know, give yourself some time to process your solution. Accepting responsibility for the code that we write and we paste. You know, no counterfeit code. not just because Git blame is a thing, but because we actually care about our users, our colleagues, our future selves. So then we can follow the evidence. So perhaps you have seen a similar problem or issue before, but is it really the same? Like, what assumptions are you making? You know, look at the current situation as it is, not as you want it to be. And of course, questioning ourselves and our opinions often and rigorously. So before we move into the next case study and the conclusions, I would just like to share a small anecdote with you, just to give a little bit of a background of how I got interested in this topic. So I took my first flight just before my 6th birthday, and I actually remember it quite clearly. It was a 4-hour flight from Melbourne to Perth in Australia. So in case you were wondering, yes, I do work at Trifork Amsterdam, and no, this is not a Dutch accent. Anyway, back then, in the crazy time that we call the 90s, if you were a curious 6-year-old, it wasn't unusual to get invited into the cockpit mid-flight. And I remember being in the cockpit and the pilot asked if I thought if it would be hotter at 30,000 feet or colder than on the ground. So my brother, 11 at the time, he said colder. And I scoffed. What would he know? My 6-year-old logic told me hotter. We were in the sky, closer to the sun, so obviously it was hotter. So the pilot, he pointed to a metal panel and he asked me to touch it. And it was ice cold. My brother laughed. So thankfully, my understanding of physics has improved since then, but my love of flying has not changed at all. Even as a fully grown adult, you will find me with my face pressed up against the window, just looking around and taking it all in. There's just, to me, something magical about being up there. And then if you add in the curiosity of an engineer, well, then you just end up being a bit of an aviation geek. So this might sound a little bit odd, given the seriousness of the topic that we are discussing today, but the next case study is actually one of my favorites, and I'm very excited to share it with you. So it's 5:05 p.m. on a cold evening a few days after Christmas in 1978. The crew of United Airlines Flight 173 are preparing to land a fully laden DC-8 in Portland, Oregon. So it's been an uneventful flight for the passengers from Denver, despite the usual, Christmas chaos at the airport. And the first officer, Rod Beebe, aged 45, he is the pilot flying. And although he is an experienced pilot, he is relatively new to the DC-8. This is a large, narrow-body aircraft with 4 jet engines and seating for 180 passengers. It is a career milestone for Beebe, which almost makes it worth being away from his young family so soon after Christmas. He's now down to an altitude of 10,000 feet, so he asked the captain and friend, Mel McBroom, to lower the landing gear. McBroom obliges. Suddenly, a loud thump echoes through the aircraft. This is followed by a jarring vibration and a sudden pull of the nose of the plane to the right. Beebe and McBroom scan their instruments. The gear light is not illuminated. So unless the light is malfunctioning, that means the gear is not fully extended. And an error deploying the landing gear would explain what their sensors just told them. What on earth was that? Yelps Second Officer Forrest Mendenhall, who goes by the nickname of Frosty. Beebe and McBroom look at Frosty and then back at each other. They know that landing without the main gear is an extremely risky maneuver that could easily turn into disaster. So it's time for them to put their training to use. So Captain McBroom, he radios Portland airport approach, and he tells them that Flight 73 will be staying at 5,000 feet and entering a holding pattern while they attempt to resolve the issue. They'll keep the speed steady at 170 knots. We've got a gear problem. We'll let you know. Portland provides a heading for the hold. So over the next 25 minutes, the three men discuss and accomplish all relevant emergency and precautionary actions in order to reassure themselves that the gear is in fact down and locked. Frosty even enters the cockpit, the cabin, to get a visual confirmation from the wing indicators. They basically pop up when the gear pops down. It's dark by now, but Frosty can indeed see them clearly. Frosty re-enters the cockpit to find Captain McBroom discussing the likelihood of an emergency landing with the head flight attendant, Joan Wheeler. An old school gentleman, the captain doesn't want to frighten the passengers or hurry the girls, as he put it. He tells the ground that he and his crew will take their time and get everybody ready before attempting a landing at Portland Airport. So the ground keeps them in a holding pattern. Joan returns to the cabin and, in unison with the rest of the cabin crew, calmly begins taking steps to maximize the chances of survival in an emergency landing. She knows that the plane is in a safe holding pattern, so she can take her time and do everything by the book. In her 14 years as a United flight attendant, she's never had to prepare for such a landing, but she makes it look effortless. She patiently reminds people of the brace position. She asks able-bodied men to sit at the emergency exits. She instructs mothers on how to best wrap their babies, and she reassures children. Now, please excuse me while I perpetuate gender roles here, but it was 1978, all right? And in the cockpit, the three men, they keep continuing to exhaust all avenues to ensure that the gear is fully down and locked. Yet in between directions from the captain, BB and Frosty are passing each other increasingly worried looks. It's now 5:55 p.m. and Flight 173 has been in a holding pattern at low altitude, the gear down, for 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. BB asks Frosty how much fuel is remaining. Frosty stutters, 4,000 pounds, one in each tank. BB does some quick math. At the current rate, they might have enough for 18 minutes. At that moment, the approach advises the next heading. It's towards the airport. BB, quick sigh of relief. Surely we're going in now. The captain, still focused on the gear, asks Frosty to do yet another sweep of the cabin just to check how things are going. The captain's number one priority at this point is a safe emergency landing with a fully prepared cabin. Frosty obliges, but he would much rather be on the flight deck as they make the final preparations for landing, which now must only be a couple of minutes away. So Frosty returns to the cockpit at 6:01 and he tells the captain that the cabin is 2 or 3 minutes away from being ready. But at that moment, he feels the plane bank to the left, away from the airport. Shit, he thinks to himself, another hold. But before he can say anything, the captain asks about the welfare of the passengers again. He's like, hey, Frosty, how are they doing back there? Yeah, they're pretty calm and cool. Some are more anxious than others. I'm doing my best to relax them while I was back there. And the captain replies, okay, well, 2 minutes before the landing, about 4 miles out, pick up the mic and tell them to assume the brace position. Frosty confirms and then takes that opportunity to gently remind the captain of the fuel situation. You know, we got 3,000 pounds of fuel left and that's it. That equates to about 13 minutes. Without flinching, the captain advises Frosty on what to do if the gear collapses on landing. 4 more minutes pass. The captain sucks Frosty and BB into a further conversation about the emergency landing and whether the gear is down or not. Joan enters the cockpit and she announces, well, I think we're ready. The captain acknowledges and advises that they will be landing in about 5 minutes. While the captain wraps up the final details with Joan, BB addresses Frosty. "Hey, buddy, I think you just lost number 4 engine." Joan thanks the captain and leaves the cockpit. "Buddy," BB continues, "I think you just lost an engine." This time, the captain is listening, and he seems surprised. "Why'd we lose an engine?" BB utters just one word, the concern on his face as clear as day: fuel. It's now 6:07, and finally the captain asks for a heading back towards the airport. The plane starts banking to the left. Engine number 3 stops. The official term for this is a flameout. Now the fuel situation has the captain's attention. He asks Frosty to open the crossfeeds. This allows whatever fuel is left to power the 2 remaining engines. The captain insists that the tank that was feeding engine number 3 still has 1,000 pounds of fuel. Tensions heighten as the captain keeps barking at Frosty about the crossfeeds and the extra 1,000 pounds of fuel that doesn't exist. At 6:09, the captain asks Portland Approach for a final heading back to the airport. He does not convey the seriousness of the situation. The airport still expects a landing where the gear might collapse. Emergency vehicles are at the airport standing by. He follows up by asking how many miles to the runway. The response is 18 nautical miles. That's 6.5 minutes. They have 5 minutes of fuel left, tops. And sure enough, 4 minutes later, at 6:13, engine 1 and 2 begin to splutter. Flameout is inevitable. Finally, the captain declares a mayday. Within seconds, a plane clips a tree and another before plowing into some power distribution cables. The plane slows as the wire straps before crashing into 2 unoccupied homes and heading into a field. There is no fire. Most of the 181 passengers on board actually survive. This includes a prisoner come fugitive who actually helped people flee the aircraft before he fled the scene. The captain and BB are among the survivors, injured but alive. Frosty and Joan, though, along with 8 others, are dead. So the next morning, the newspapers hit the stands. And without not yet knowing exactly what happened in the cockpit, the media labels Captain McBroom a hero. They cite the miraculous landing without injuries or deaths of people on the ground. Survivors praise the flight attendants for the preparedness of the cabin and the orderly evacuation. It could have been a lot worse. But why did it happen in the first place? That's a good question. I have the answer. I'll tell you after the session. So United Airlines Flight 173, so this is arguably the most important crash in aviation history. So if you ever took a flight after 1985, then I guarantee you that your safety has been impacted by this flight. And in the final report, the investigators list a probable cause and a contributing factor. So the cause was the captain's failure to properly monitor the aircraft's fuel state and to respond to both the low fuel state and the crew members' advisories regarding the fuel state. The factor contributing to the accident was the failure of BB and Frosty to either fully comprehend the criticality of the fuel state or to successfully communicate their concern to the captain. And the most alarming part of these findings was that they were not isolated. They were only the latest in a string of air crashes with similar causes. In the 1960s and 70s, the number of flights were growing dramatically, as were the number of crashes. For example, the most famous crash before Flight 173 was the Tenerife Air Disaster in 1977. In this crash, 2 fully laden 747s collided on the runway, killing 583 passengers and crew. And similar to Flight 173, the probable cause of this crash was a breakdown in communication, except this time it was both in in and outside of the two cockpits, air traffic control also played a role. So in this broader context, the recommendations from Flight 173 were very timely. NASA had already identified the issue of human error in the cockpit and were working on a solution called Crew Resource Management, or CRM. And I know hearing the acronym might make you shudder a little bit if you've ever worked on a customer relationship management system, but for today, it means Crew Resource Management. And in the investigation report of Flight 173, airliners were told to give this training to their pilots. Specifically, the crew resource management training should have two themes. Should have participative management for captains. So in other words, providing a non-threatening environment that actively encourages collaboration. And assertiveness training for the other cockpit crew members. So how to get your point across effectively in a non-threatening manner. Now, in modern organization terms, you could actually summarize this as ensuring psychological safety in the cockpit, which I find really, really interesting because this predates the term psychological safety by about 20 years. And what's also really interesting with this is the emphasis on the assertiveness of the co-pilots. So it's not just a responsibility of the captain to provide a safe space. The other crew members also need to take responsibility for how their message or advice is received. And in the decades that have followed the implementation of CRM, starting with United Airlines, obviously, in 1981, the culture of aviators has actually changed markedly. It's no longer a case of the captain knows best. Every young pilot knows, no matter their experience level, that they not only have the right, but they have the responsibility to speak up when something is not quite right. You could argue that in software, the stakes aren't as high as human lives. But what if your failure to speak up sparks a chain of events that results in a data breach, a loss of faith with a major customer, or worse, a loss of faith in yourself? Of course, being prepared to speak up is different from knowing when to speak up. So how can you better tell if things are wrong or require further examination, that decisions are being made that ignore key evidence? We already got some tips from Finn and the team in Norway, but what about Captain McBroom? He can teach us a lot about situational awareness. This is a fundamental concept for aviators. Put simply, situational awareness is knowing what's going on around you. In the case study, we saw Captain McBroom getting increasingly fixated on the landing gear issue, which left him unable to process the criticality of the fuel situation. He had lost his situational awareness. And if you are the proud owner of a human brain, it is very, very easy for you to lose your situational awareness. Much easier than anyone would like to admit. So for example, have you ever dived into an issue so deep and you got caught in the technical wonder, you kind of lost sight the problem was that you're working on in the first place? Or were you just so focused on getting to the conference today on time that you failed to notice what a beautiful day it is? As an engineer, if you fail to maintain awareness of your situation, you end up with a perfectly engineered feature that nobody wants, or a hot fix for a small ordering issue that leaves your app unable to process payments. So how can we maintain situational awareness in our role as software professionals? This is a list that I've adopted from crew resource management training interpreted in the software engineering context. So you can maintain your situational awareness by considering the impact of stress on your workload and on your performance. For example, how many tickets are assigned to you right now? How many meetings do you have planned? Which deadlines are real and which are arbitrary? Be honest with yourself and with others on what you can accomplish. Having an appreciation of the automation and the abstractions present. So are you aware of the abstractions that you interact with, even if on a rudimentary level? So could you find the resources you need if the situation required it? So do you have a basic understanding of what happens when you run a job in Jenkins, for example? Like, what's it doing and what could go wrong? Paying attention to and meeting your physiological needs. So did you sleep enough? Are you hydrated? Did you eat? Did you poop? Recognizing that you carry around preconceptions and bias wherever you go. So is your gut instinct really just bias? Why does a certain course of action appeal to you? What evidence do you have to support your position? And what evidence against? And being aware of your limitations, for example, as they relate to your abilities, experience, and training, and communicating them when relevant. What are your limitations or weak spots with respect to your role? How can you patch them? Who can help you? What knowledge could you share with others? And crucially, maintaining situational awareness does not have to be a solo endeavor. So by encouraging an environment where everybody can speak up and share their knowledge and challenge ideas, then you lift the situational awareness of your team and your organization, your crew. And this has been known and practiced in aviation for years already, leads to better decision-making and better results. My name is Adele, and thank you so much for your time. Okay, so we had a question. This is great. We've got one question to start things off. Hopefully that keeps that going. We do have a bit of time. So yes, the gear was in fact down and locked. So do we have any more questions about this topic? So you've got a few to choose from. We've got airplane nerd stuff. We've got teamwork, communication. No? All right, well, let's go party. All right.